everybody. So now we're moving on to part 2 of Aristotle's virtue ethics, where we'll actually talk about what virtues are, how to get them, and how they're so important for ethics. So, like with all our other theories, we're going to talk about the good and the right. The good for Aristotle and for virtue ethics is this concept of a life well lived. And this is the idea that you can look back on your life and kind of give it this overall assessment and say, hey, yes, I did that well, that was a good life. Now, Aristotle defines that not in terms of monetary wealth or other more tangible factors, but having achieved an overall balance in life. So the term that Aristotle used for this is eudaimonia, and it's usually translated into English as happiness. We need to be really careful with that because the type of happiness that we're talking about isn't the same thing that we usually mean when we use the word in English. So instead of happiness, I want you to think of this concept of a life well lived and an overall assessment of a person's life. So this is something that is inherently valuable. In other words, it's valuable for its own sake. And it's something that you can only assess at the end of your life. So it's something that you're going to assess for the totality of your life. It's not a temporary feeling of pleasure. It is an overall evaluation of your life. So then the right is what's going to take us there, right? That's our path to eudaimonia, or what we need to do in order to accomplish this life that's well lived. So cultivating virtues is how we do that. And we have to cultivate these virtues, these good character traits, using reason, which, as we saw before, is the only character trait, or the only trait that's unique to human beings. So the next question is, what are virtues exactly, and how do I use reason to get them? So here's our definition of virtue, and the reason why it's all colorful is because that these individual portions of this sentence are very important to the definition of virtue. So virtue is a character trait manifested in habitual action that's good for a person to have. So let's unpack this a little bit. A character trait means it's a part of your personality. It does not mean that it's inherent. It's not something you're born with. It's something that you can cultivate. How do you cultivate that? Well, you make it apparent to others that you have this character trait. In other words, you show to other people that you have it through repeated and constant behaviors or actions. So these character traits are not hidden, they're not secret. I can look at other people and based on their apparent, repeated, consistent actions, tell whether they have certain character traits or not. And it's good for a person to have. This is the type of thing that's going to lead to eudaimonia. And the reason why that seems very obvious, but the reason why we have that in there is that not all character traits are good. Some character traits are bad to have, and we call those vices. So in summary then, repeated habitual actions are going to lead to virtue. The idea here is that nobody is born virtuous, but if you practice becoming virtuous by acting repeatedly as a virtuous person would, over time that will become a habit and then you will have acquired that virtue. So Aristotle gives us some examples of virtues. However, he says that he never says that we always have to use this set of examples. So when you're thinking about virtues and character traits that you think are good for people to have, it's good to think about what those character traits are that you would emphasize. They don't have to be the same as Aristotle's. So let's just look at some of the examples that he gives so that we can talk about them. And we can clarify these concepts a little more. He talks about courage, temperance or moderation, liberality or generosity, amiability, that means friendliness or likability, truthfulness, and wit. So all of these, he's going to say, represent what we call a perfect midpoint or golden mean between too much of a character trait and not enough. So the golden mean is where our ability to reason comes in. It's the way that we need to use to analyze ourselves, our own inherent tendencies, and our own situation in life in order to figure out what for us this sort of perfect, wonderful, balanced midpoint is between too much of a character trait or not enough of it. So let's see how that's going to work. The idea here is that all virtues represent this perfect midpoint between extremes. If we have an excess, we have too much of it. If we have a deficiency, we don't have enough of that quality. These extremes are known as vices. So a vice is just either too much or not enough of this character trait that's good to have if you've got it in this middle point, this golden mean between excess and deficiency. So we can look at this with some examples. If the virtue is courage, it's definitely possible to have too much courage, right? In that case, we would say that that person is reckless. And we can all think of examples of that. I know that one of my daughters, when she was younger, used to just run and jump into the pool in the deep end without anybody, without warning anybody. She couldn't swim, right? That's a great example of recklessness. But if someone doesn't have enough courage, we would say that they have the vice of cowardice. We can do the same thing with generosity. With generosity, it is actually possible to be too generous. Aristotle calls this extravagance. It's basically giving away too much of yourself or of your resources to such an extent that it's a detriment to you, and you might be doing it to show off. But if you're not generous enough, then we probably would call that stinginess. We can also do this with qualities like truthfulness, that it may seem on the surface of it you can't have too much of. But it is actually possible to be too truthful. We may call this oversharing. So a good thing to think about is we don't say everything that is true just because it is true. So several days ago, I gave you the example of the roommates, and one of them looked really bad in her outfit, and the other one was trying to figure out what to say. Right? So the idea here is that she can be truthful and say, maybe you want to try on another outfit there, but she wouldn't want to, simply because it's true, give a long detailed list of all the ways in which her friend looks bad, right? We would consider that too much truthfulness. The problem isn't that she's being insincere or lying. The problem is that she doesn't need to say all the true things that she is saying. And of course, not enough truthfulness would be withholding information or lying. Amiability is another one. Friendliness or being likable, as we said before. If a person can be too friendly, down here with the cat, right? Too friendly, she's sitting on the mouse instead of being friends with it. So sometimes we call this obsequiousness. In more common American vernacular, we might call this person a kiss-up or a brown-noser, right? Someone who's like intentionally making themselves a teacher's pet, or is really ingratiating themselves to someone in order to get rewards. But someone also could be not friendly enough, and Aristotle calls this indifference, right? The idea that you just don't really care about whether other people like you. So we can see now how all of these virtues, there's a midpoint, that's the good quality, and then the vices or the bad character traits are either too much or not enough of that same trait. So this is why we need reason. We can't just pick a characteristic and try to act that way all the time. We need to figure out where the golden mean lies and then work to get there. So the next question is, are virtues the same for everybody? In other words, can we all and should we all be aspiring to have the same exact character traits? Aristotle says no. And the reason for that is that the extent to which you ought to cultivate certain virtues and where the golden mean lies for you is going to depend on what you do, on your function in life. What do we mean by that? Well, a soldier who's engaged in battle and war is going to have a different standard for courage than a philosophy professor, is going to have. And if I start acting like a soldier does in wartime, or like a police officer does when she's in the line of duty, then I'm probably not going to be displaying a good virtue of courage for myself. I'm probably going to be behaving reckless because relative to my job and my life and what I do, I've got a different golden mean. So in order to become virtuous, we have to do a lot of thinking and a lot of analysis. So nobody's born virtuous, according to Aristotle. We're all born actually with basic inherent tendencies towards one extreme or the other, towards the vices. So one person might be inherently reckless, another person might be inherently stingy, or more or less amiable. We have to figure out which side of that we tend towards. We're all born with the ability, though, to use reason to become virtuous. So virtue is something that's available to everyone, even though nobody's born with them. So because we're each naturally inclined to certain vices, there are certain steps that we need to take in order to drag ourselves away from those very tempting vices and make sure that we achieve this golden mean of courage, or of virtue rather. So first of all, you determine unique function. What is it that you're really doing in life? Are you a parent? Are you a soldier? Are you a student? Are you a teacher? This is going to change depending on what your situation is at a given time. Then you determine the golden mean in relation to your own specific function. And then what you do is you develop a habit. You repeatedly act in a way that's consistent with that virtue that you want to cultivate, right? So because nobody's born with it, this is going to take some work and practice. You have to develop a habit of virtue through habitual, repeated action until you will eventually internalize that character trait. You don't have to force yourself. You don't have to think about it anymore. You just do it. That's how you know that it's become a habit. So how do you know when you have acquired a virtue? You're aware of your actions, You can deliberately choose them, and your virtuous acts are habitual. You don't have to think about it. This is also the point, though, where you probably need to stop and reassess and see if you need something about your situation has changed in such a way that you need to think about if you're still occupying that golden mean. So when you don't have to force yourself to behave virtuously, then you know you've developed that character trait. So this is a lifelong process because, as I said, our roles in life are always changing. We're not always going to be who we are now. You may not always be a student. You may not always occupy the same profession that you have now. If you don't have children now, you might have children in the future, and that might change some of your roles and responsibilities. If you are raising children now, they're going to be grown and out of the house eventually, and that will also change your roles and responsibilities. There are lots and lots of ways in which our roles in life are always changing, and for this reason, we have to constantly reevaluate our habits and our character in relation to that. So that's the last for this section. What we're going to do next is look at some modern critiques and evaluations of virtue and talk about the role of moral exemplars or role models as a tool to cultivate virtue.